Let's take a look at Pojman's defensive ethical objectivism. This is not a criticism of Pojman, but I have to say that I don't think that this essay really is that difficult. I mean, that is, I don't really think that it warrants or it needs perhaps the kind of guidance, perhaps, that some of the other things that we've read, Harma and Thomas Aquinas, have. And maybe that's a virtue of the essay, that it really doesn't need much explaining. It's written very well. So I'm just going to walk through it a little bit and just talk about some of the highlights, but I really think that you don't really need any help reading this. But we're doing essays on it, or we're doing videos and everything, so let's go ahead and do it. We get in the beginning of the essay, we get pretty much his definition of what moral relativism is. And I suppose the first really important distinction is here on page 39, when he makes this distinction between the diversity thesis and the dependency thesis. So right here, the diversity thesis. And then a little later on, the dependency thesis in the next column. The diversity thesis is benign from his point of view. That is, it's kind of obviously true, but doesn't really have many implications for moral philosophy, because it just recognizes that there is cultural diversity. There's a diversity in customs between different peoples, and there is a diversity in moral beliefs, and you might say moral systems, if there is such a thing, between different communities through history. It's the number one there, that the moral rightness and wrongness of actions vary from society to society. So there are no universal moral standards held by all societies. Maybe untrue from Pojman's point of view, but the reason I said it's benign is that it's really no threat to the moral objectivist, because all it says is that there is a ethical diversity amongst the world's cultures through history. It doesn't say that morality itself varies in its truth. It just says that people's take on morality varies, and perhaps that's kind of undeniably true. It's only really number two there. Whether or not it is right for individuals to act in a certain way depends on, or is relative to, the society to which they belong. And that's a much more radical thesis, and that does have all sorts of implications for moral theory, and really sets up the conclusion there, number three, that there are no absolute or objective moral standards that apply to all people everywhere. It's really only with number two that we can really assert that. The first thesis is just about the diversity, empirically as it exists. There is diversity. The second says that there's no objective standard to judge between that diversity. Right? That is, that the moral truths themselves are relative to those customs, and there is no objective truth. So compare the beliefs about science, about nature, that have existed through history. I mean, there have been all sorts of varying ideas about how nature works. But that doesn't mean that they were all correct, or that they all have to be judged relative to themselves. The scientific truth is completely relative to cultural belief. We would probably say that that's not true, that there is a truth of the matter. Whether or not a particular culture recognizes it is another thing. The objectivist pretty much has to say that morality is kind of like that, to some extent at least, that there are moral truths, at least fundamental ones, that are true whether or not a particular person or a particular culture acknowledges them. This is why I've said in class all along that an objectivist has to conclude that there's always the possibility of mistake, that the diversity of moral opinion may be accounted for by the fact that some people are wrong about morality, just as the diversity in our opinions about other types of knowledge, scientific knowledge, may be accounted for by the fact that some people are wrong. I mean, the ancient peoples almost universally believed that the sun revolved around the earth, And that was incorrect, says the objectivist. Doesn't matter how many people believed it was still wrong. Well, to be a moral objectivist, perhaps with many qualifications, but you would have to fundamentally believe that something along those lines was true in morality too, that a whole culture could be wrong, certainly at least partly wrong, about what is actually good and evil. But the dependency thesis is the idea that there is no such objective criterion to judge. He says there, number 2, the second thesis, the dependency thesis, asserts that individual acts are right or wrong depending on the nature of the society from which they emanate. And that's the more radical thesis. And that his real target in this essay is not moral diversity, or the diversity thesis, but the dependency thesis. And I suppose, moreover, what he distinguishes between a strong thesis of dependency and a weak one here. The weak dependency thesis would say that there's diversity in the way that moral principles are applied in different cultures, so that you'll have differences in, let's say, particular details, which is certainly something that Thomas Aquinas recognizes, that there'll be differences in particular judgments. But a strong dependency thesis would say that there is no common basis. As he says here, but the ethical relativist must maintain a stronger thesis, one that insists that the moral principles themselves are products of the culture and may vary from society to society, as differing from the weak dependency thesis, which would say that it's only the application of the principles that differs, not the principles themselves. So the strong dependency thesis would say that there is no commonality. And that is exactly what Pojman is trying to deny here. Denying the strong dependency thesis, I guess, to correct myself from before. Maybe we'll come back here to subjectivism, which is radical relativism, the Ted Bundy challenge. Maybe we'll get back to that. I don't know. But we know that the big idea here in Pojman is the defense of some form of objectivism that would deny the strong dependency thesis by claiming that, of course, there is diversity in the way that principles are applied through the world's cultures, but there is also a core set of principles that is universal, or at least should be universal, I suppose, even if it's not. Where does that come in? I guess it's later in the essay. I suppose it's section 5, the case for moral objectivism. And here he begins to put that together on page 47 when he suggests that there is, here's a sample of the kind of thing that he believes would form something like a part of what he calls a core morality, something that he thinks would be undeniable to anyone and would be part of a universal morality, that no imaginable morality could deny it. And this is what he says here, that such a principle as this: it is morally wrong to torture people for the fun of it. I claim, he says, that this principle is binding on all rational agents, so that This is the kind of thing that he thinks couldn't be part of any viable morality, that it was not morally wrong to torture people for the fun of it. I asked in class if you could imagine a culture in which that wasn't true. Let's say a culture in which a community would torture to death captives from enemy communities that it was fighting with, and do so for fun, or to have fun doing so. And there have been such communities, right? I mean, there have been such communities in which, they who vie with each other over resources and are always at war with each other, so that when any of them sort of fall into the hands of the enemy culture, they're tortured to death. There have been such cultures. Maybe they've been rare. I don't know, but kind of a challenge even to that. Well, Pojman would have to say, well, if they do that, then it's wrong that they do that. That there's just no way that can be part of. There's something wrong with this, with the morality of those people, I suppose. But that's the idea, and I don't think it's too far away from what Thomas Aquinas says. The idea that there are some fundamental principles that form the basis for morality, and there may be differences in the way that they are actually applied, but they would have to be universally accepted just because they appeal to reason, I suppose Thomas would say. And Pojman gives a full list of them on page 48. Do not kill innocent people, do not cause unnecessary pain or suffering, etc. And here's where he uses the expression core morality. He says these 10 principles are examples of the core morality, principles necessary for the good life. They are not arbitrary, for we can give reasons why they are necessary to social cohesion and human flourishing. That is, he can't imagine, I suppose, any viable morality for a community that wanted to actually live good lives in which these things were not honored, or at least were not generally accepted. Well, okay. It's certainly a strong assertion. It certainly has something going for it. And again, I don't think it's all that different from the kind of things that Thomas Aquinas would say. Aquinas believes that there are self-evident first principles of practical reason, basically first principles of morality, and that they are immediately evident to any rational creature that they are morally correct. They are correct, that they are the correct moral principles. That's not a bad thesis. I think it's definitely plausible. The question is whether in the long run it really holds up. This is a short essay, and one small essay could never establish such a really ambitious thesis about morality. Seems that he puts that up there, the core morality thing, as an alternative to what he sees really as the problems with ethical relativism. And those are the usual objections against ethical relativism. And I'm not saying that they're weak just because they're usual. But they basically boil down to, if we don't have an objective foundation for morality, and we don't believe that there are universal moral truths, and either moral truths are entirely up to the individual, so they're true for that individual, or they are, if that doesn't work, they're at least socially relative to communities, which would be a form of cultural relativism or conventionalism, actually. That we have nothing to say against the serial killers like Ted Bundy, who assert that their moral outlook is just as valid as any others, even though they're disgusting killers. Or if we accept cultural relativism, we have no way of criticizing the injustices that we see in other societies or in societies through history. I suppose if, let's say in the antebellum South, if we say that there was something of a consensus that slavery was okay and it was moral, then I guess it was moral for them. And we have no basis for criticizing them for being a slave-owning society. Or in contemporary terms, let's say those societies that, as he mentions, require women to get, um, is it clitoridectomies, have their clitorises removed, which is sometimes referred to as female circumcision and sometimes referred to as female genital mutilation. Basically, mutilating girls in puberty and taking away much of the pleasure that they would get from sex through removing this part of their bodies. I mean, that is really terrible to our ears and unjust and a violation of human rights. But, says Pojman, hey, you just admitted that you're a cultural relativist, so you really can't, you have no basis for criticizing any other cultures, because you've just said that what's right is relative to cultural practice and belief. So that within that culture, those things are accepted as completely acceptable and as right. So what basis do you criticize them? These are well-known criticisms of relativism, and take them for what they are. I mean, they're serious objections to be taken into consideration. The question is whether they're really fatal. Looking ahead to Gilbert Harman's essay on conventionalism, he's fully willing to say that, let's say that somebody like Hitler, that it's very strange to say that Hitler ought not to have done what he did. He's willing to say that, to admit that you really can't do that, but it doesn't mean, for him, it doesn't really have the kind of disastrous consequences that Pojman believes would result from not being able to say he was morally wrong. I mean, we all recognize, according to our own principles, just how horrible the things that were done, say by the Nazis in general, were. The fact that Hitler himself, that doesn't really make any sense to say that he did something wrong, doesn't mean that we're somehow unable to correctly characterize what he did as evil and something that should be stopped and something that should never happen again. So it really depends, I suppose. There are definitely weaknesses in relativism and moral relativisms of all kinds, but like every other moral theory, the question is whether you believe those weaknesses are so serious that they pretty much defeat the theory. I suppose that's something you should think about.